Please welcome Sourya from NCC Group.
Hi guys. Last session of the conference, right? So I can see some people yawning, so hopefully I can retain your attention for the next 20 odd minutes. A little context around the title, East versus West. When I say East versus West, I'm specifically referring to Wall Street and Silicon Valley. In fact, the financial services firms or FS firms in Wall Street and the tech companies in Silicon Valley. I know exceptions exist, right? I mean, there are banks in California, there are tech companies in New York. But for the purpose of this presentation, I would be focusing on those industries which are most closely identified with these two geographies. First, a bit of introduction. I didn't know it would be such a large screen. But as you can see from the picture, unlike most things security, this is one place where I'm okay with legacy, perhaps deprecated information, because this picture is more than a decade old. And my wife told me that you know that they will be able to see you, right? So in terms of my experience, I have worked in both the coasts, in banks, in tech companies, both as an operator, as in security teams, as well as a consultant advising such teams. So hopefully I have the experience to talk about what I'm going to talk about. Now, before I move on to how information security is different in Wall Street and Silicon Valley, I would like to take a few moments to explore how these two industries are themselves different. And I would like to quote Mr. Rudyard Kipling here, "East is East and West is West, and never the twain shall meet." I'm sure he meant it in a different context, but it works well. Now, first, when I'm describing the differences between these two industries, I would like to talk about what I call decision factors, what drives decision making. And the reason I say this is because information security does not exist in isolation, right? It exists to meet the needs of the business. And in my experience, FS and tech are quite different as regards their business needs. For FS firms, the primary business need is compliance. It's not that they're not concerned about customer friendliness, but because of the myriad laws and regulations that they need to abide by, Dodd-Frank, GLBA, anti-money laundering, and the huge fines associated with non-compliance, usually compliance takes precedence over customer friendliness. On the other hand, with tech, they are more concerned in meeting the needs of the customer. I know recently there have been all these privacy regs, right? GLBA, CCP, etc. However, in general, the regulatory burden for tech companies is less. And that also kind of plays into the organizational culture. With FS firms, it's all about going by the book, dotting the I's and crossing the T's, moving slow as long as you're doing it right. Whereas with tech firms, it's all about move fast and break things. I'm sure you recognize the motto. So it's for tech firms, mistakes are acceptable as long as you're learning from them and delivering fast. Now, I would like to move on to what I call success factors. What kind of determines success? And in my experience, the golden triangle of people, process, and technology are responsible for the success of any program implementation, and this includes an information security program as well. In my experience, FS and tech differ in their maturities of people, process, technology, those three pillars. So obviously green means good, and I've rated both FS and tech good in the people aspect. And again, this is not unexpected, right? I mean, Silicon Valley is the center of technological innovation. Wall Street is the center of the financial world. I mean, London may disagree vis-a-vis its ranking with New York, but in general, it's not unexpected that the centers of these two industries would attract the cream of the crop. That's why people are great in both Wall Street and Silicon Valley. Call out to you guys there. For process, unfortunately, tech firms are not as mature as financial services. So as I mentioned, FS firms are all about doing things by the book, right? making things, ensuring that things happen right the first time, even if that be slow. And that's why they have very mature documented processes, formal process ownership, etc. Whereas with tech firms, it has been my experience that they're more concerned about the results, right? Process be damned, or well, not damned, maybe not as important. So they're really not good at writing things down. It's all in the head of some very intelligent people. However, that obviously is a single point of failure, like this over-dependence on tribal knowledge. On the technology pillar, again, this is expected, right? I mean, tech firms by their definition are better at technology than FS firms. Obviously, I will provide some illustrative examples to kind of support these points, but that's for later. Now, moving on as to how information security is different in Wall Street and Silicon Valley. Now, before I move on to the differences themselves, I would like to take a moment to discuss defense in depth, also known as the castle approach or layered security. So as you can see from the example, right, the castle, the knight on a horse, kind of the attacker, this concept is fundamentally very simple, right? The idea is to have multiple layers of security such that even if a threat breaches one layer, it would be blocked by another, right? And in the modern world, the CISO is the lord of the castle, protecting that castle, the enterprise, from the hacker, and to do that, the CISO implements defense in depth through administrative, physical, and technical security. Now, in my experience, the decision factors and the success factors that I mentioned earlier, they kind of drive how defense in depth is implemented in FS and tech. And again, for administrative security, I have rated FS as more mature than tech firms. Again, this is not unexpected because admin security has a lot of alignment with the process pillar of the golden triangle that I mentioned, right? FS firms are typically better at processes, documenting processes and following them, unlike tech firms. For physical security, also, I've rated FS firms as better than tech. As you can imagine, the yellow means cautionary, the green means good. And I have a couple of theories around this. So even though today we are all about electronic transactions and credit card swipes and all that, FS firms, specifically banks, if you think about it, at one point of time, they dealt with something very tangible, cash, right? A physical asset. And this asset faced a real physical threat from physical bank robbers, right? Think about like the Wild West, bank robbers riding in on horses, Yahoo, and all that, right? So I think that kind of contributed to this ethos of mature physical security at FS firms. The second theory is something that I'm thankful to Mike Johnson, CISO at Fastly for, because I was discussing this topic with him. And this interesting kind of idea came about. If you think of the banks and other FS firms on Wall Street, they're typically housed in this huge, tall buildings, right? With a single point of entry on the first floor. So unless the attacker is Tom Cruise on a Mission Impossible dropping in from a helicopter or something like that, they typically need to secure only that single point of entry. Contrast that with Silicon Valley, where the big players are in large spread out campuses, the smaller players are in shared working spaces, none of which are conducive to physical security. Now moving on to technical security, again, this relative rating is not unexpected, and also I will provide some examples around this, but tech firms, by their definition and the nature of the work that they do, are usually better at technical security than FS firms. Now moving on to these examples. So around administrative security, which is all about rules and regulations, policies, standards, procedures, security awareness training, etc. What I've seen are some of these examples, and again, the green is good, the yellow is cautionary. So you will see that for a top 10 US bank, I saw like extensive policies, standards, procedures with each process having a formal owner as well as a secondary owner. And at a client insurance company, there were no local admin privileges, use of USB drives was prohibited. Contrast that with this quantum computing client of mine, and you can understand, right? Quantum computing, right? So the cutting edge of science, so to speak. But they had an utter lack of documentation. And all the critical processes, right, IT and security processes were dependent on one single very intelligent individual. Now, if that individual were to get hit by a bus, or better yet, win the lottery, then pardon my French, that company is screwed. Also, at this IoT software developer, another client of mine, I saw that they were actually advertising jobs saying that, hey, come work for us. You can use any software you want. So basically, all users had full local admin on their machines, and there was no restriction on USB usage. Obviously, that made data extrusion as well as malware intrusion much easier. Moving on to physical security, also, as I mentioned, FS firms are typically better than tech firms. So again, at a top 10 US bank, I saw that they had badged access with man traps, which were also being monitored by security personnel. So basically, 3 controls around that same area, right? Badged access, man traps allowing only one person to enter at a time, and again, a security person was actually monitoring that. Compare that with this client of mine. They develop software for rewards programs. And I'm quoting the CEO verbatim, right? He said, everything's in the cloud. I don't need physical security. So this guy, this office, right, had multiple points of entry, no CCTVs, no badged entry, right? So I told him, okay, consider this hypothetical scenario. You are logged into your AWS admin account. You step away for a cup of coffee. I walk in and walk away with your laptop. Is that a concern for you? He said yes. So as you can see, even when everything's in the cloud, there's still room for physical security. Again, at this asset management firm client of mine, I saw that they had extensive CCTV coverage where the feed was not only being recorded, but it was being actually monitored live, right? So it's not being recorded just for review in case an incident happened. So that's like a kind of detective control. They're actually doing it live, so that becomes a preventive control. Compare that with this LMS developer client of mine. And by the way, I've seen this at multiple firms in the Bay Area. So I go in to the office location. I sign in on a tablet. My host is notified, and he or she comes out and escorts me in. Now note the gap here. If you think about this IEEE quartet of identification, authentication, authorization, and auditing. So I provided an identity, but I never authenticated it. So I could have put in any name, right? Nobody asked for proof of that identity. And the fix is very simple, right? I mean, ask me for my driver's license, but again, something that is often overlooked. Moving on to technical security, obviously the situation reverses itself. At this international bank client of mine, I saw that they were using deprecated technologies, right? So their systems were unpatched. They were using insecure encryption like TLS 1.0, which has been considered insecure for quite some time. Also old browser versions, leaving them susceptible to drive-by downloads. At the social media company client of mine in the Bay Area, mature vulnerability management, fast incident response, so usually technical controls are much better. Again, at this auto finance captive client of mine, they had a vulnerability management program. In a sense, they were doing scanning, right? They were finding vulnerabilities, but there were so many rules and layers of approval required to remediate those vulnerabilities that basically they are being left unpatched for a long time. So kind of shades of that particular company handling our credit information and their Apache Struts vulnerability, right? So compare that again with this mobile app developer. They had this, instead of this multiple layers of approval, there was this bias for automation where they were kind of reducing the need for human intervention. And that is good because, as we know, humans are the weakest link in information security. Moving on, why should we care? Why should we care about all these differences? And I want to answer this question from 2 perspectives. One that I call the assessor perspective, as in somebody doing an assessment, and the other, the operator perspective, somebody actually working in these companies. So my hypothesis is this, that if you're an assessor, when you go on site at any of the companies in these industries, you place a greater focus on things that are not traditionally that company's forte, or in this case, that industry's forte. So I've illustrated this with some examples. So if I'm doing a NIST CSF cybersecurity framework assessment, right, at a financial services firm, I would put a greater focus on controls that I've mentioned there. For example, PRDS2, data in transit is being protected. That's the actual NIST-CSF control, right? And what you see, the text in red, those are gaps that I found. I'm not going to read through all of them, but you can see that for financial services firms, I found several gaps around technical controls, whereas, financial services, I found several gaps around technical controls, whereas with tech firms, usually the gaps are around administrative security and physical security controls. For example, I would like to mention this first one, PRAC2. Physical access to assets is managed and protected. So one of the things that I look at when I'm evaluating the maturity of this control is the presence of alarms. And again, this is something that I've seen at many Bay Area companies. There are alarms for forced entry, but there is no alarm for that door just being held open. So basically makes tailgating so much easier. Now from the operational perspective, my messaging is this, that operational personnel across the two domains should focus on their relative weaknesses and learn from the other strengths. So let's say that I work in the security team for a bank. I would look towards my peers in the tech firms to understand how they've implemented technical controls. So what I've done on this slide is I've basically consolidated all the pros and cons, right? So for financial services, obviously, as we kind of covered earlier, strong admin and physical security with mature documented processes. However, weak in technical security and usually slower decision-making, which makes them laggards in adopting new tech. Whereas with tech firms, usually stronger technical security, not so much for physical and administrative security, but they're early adopters of new technology and there's this bias for automation. However, sometimes this excessive bias for freedom and excessive bias for action can lead to certain changes which are not security validated. So obviously that's another con. Now moving on to the last section of my presentation, how does it all come together? And here I would like to revisit that quote from Mr. Kipling earlier. And interestingly, those two lines are followed by two more. East is east and west is west, and never the twain shall meet, till earth and sky stand presently at God's great judgment seat. In my opinion, God's great judgment seat today is our shared, connected technology ecosystem. Whether it be FS firms or tech firms, they're using similar technologies. That kinds of makes them vulnerable to similar attackers, right? And unlike those bank robbers of old who actually had to face the risk of being shot, the attackers today can be on the other side of the globe, possibly in a non-extradition treaty country, and they can attack multiple targets at once. And here I would like to quote Mario Puzo in The Godfather, one of my favorite books. And he wrote, "A lawyer with his briefcase can steal more than 100 men with guns." Now replace lawyer with his briefcase with hacker with his or her laptop, and any company in any industry can be the target. So what I want to really emphasize on is that Wall Street and Silicon Valley must come together to share, right, and learn from each other. Because with all the three pillars of the Golden Triangle, this edifice of the information security program will crumble. Without all the three layers of defense in depth, this castle of the enterprise will be breached, right? So it's important to share and learn, and obviously a forum such as BSides is a great place to do exactly that. I would like to wrap up with my last slide here. So I love this cartoon, by the way, right? You have all these controls, and on the other hand, you have Dave. Apologies to any Daves out here. I didn't draw this cartoon, but I love it. So if you recall when I was discussing the Golden Triangle, right, people, process, technology, I mentioned that both Silicon Valley and Wall Street have excellent, very intelligent people. True. But even intelligent people can fall prey to social engineering, right? Because that is predicated on exploiting normal human behavior. And that is why, for everybody across the board, security awareness training is key. Now, finally, I would like to end with this core message, is that with all this font of knowledge, all this information sharing, sometimes it makes sense to bring in a third party to remove this confirmation bias, to eliminate this conflict of interest, right, if you're doing your own assessments. And obviously to keep people like me with a job. So if in doubt, bring in an external expert to play the devil's advocate. Thank you.